Comfort ye my people, saith your God. Speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem, and cry unto her that her warfare is accomplished, that her iniquity is pardoned. For she hath received of the Lord's hand double for all her sins. The voice of him that crieth in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places plain. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it. The voice said, Cry. And
Shineth, what pleasing grace.
straight and the rough places plain. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together.
Now, good morning. Good morning. Would you like to have a seat, please? Thank you. Good morning. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. I'd like to begin today by greeting all of you and welcoming you to this special place for Norman. My name is Peter Bosher. I'm New Zealand's Chief Ombudsman, but more importantly, I'm a Gisborne boy and an old friend of Norman's. As we begin the service, I want to greet you, the close family. So I greet you, Gavin and Catherine and your families, Coralie and Robert and your families, Alistair and Catherine, children of the late Barbara, also noting that not able to be present is Rachel in Ireland and Julian in Dunedin. Now, there are some announcements it's good to make at the beginning of a very large event such as this. And the first, inevitably, is for me to ask you to check your mobile phones to make sure that no one can contact you. Secondly, just keep an eye out for fire escapes, which are pretty evident, but it's important. And if anything else arises, we will let you know. At the conclusion of the service, the family invite you to remain, to share memories, to commune, and to have some refreshments in the marquee. A remembrance book is available, and if you haven't already done so, you're invited to. My task and privilege here today is to officiate, and that to me means to make sure that you all feel welcome and comfortable, and that we celebrate the life of Norman in a way that you all individually feel is right. In this respect, it's the role of others to talk about the aspects of Norman's life and not unduly for me to do so. But I think it's good that you know where I fit in and why I am here. I was a student here at Boys High between 1965 and 1969. I met Norman in 1968, and he both tutored debating and public speaking events, and we had great success. He also produced drama such as the Pohuta Kawatri, which was on the stage in front of us. Although it didn't seem like it at the time, Norman wasn't actually that much older than some of us. And perhaps that helped the connectivity and the rapport that developed between us. It is because of Norman that some of us developed the skills and the confidence to use those tools to the best possible effect in our lives. Norman and I maintained good contact, and I last saw him at home in April this year when I was here in my role as the Ombudsman, looking at the consequence of extreme weather in Gisborne and the East Coast. As Norman knew that the end of his life was in sight, he requested me to take this service, and it's a privilege I richly acknowledge and thank the family for. So I'm going to commence by asking you, Catherine, if you would commence us today by singing Alleluia from Exultate Jubilate. Catherine. As I discovered at Waimata Valley Road last night, this is a family of immense talent. Thank you very much, Catherine and Belinda. We start now on tributes, and Philip is going to say for us the eulogy. Where are you, Philip? Here you are. Handily at the end of the row. Philip, would you commence us, please?
Well, good morning. As Peter's introduced me, my name is Philip Andrew, and I grew up here in Gisborne, and today I live in Wellington. I'm here today to tell you a story. It's a story about a beautiful soul, and I've called the story In One Stupendous Lifetime. Norman Hayden Mclean was born in 1946 in the railway junction town of Martin, one of 3 children, Barbara, Gavin, and Norman, of course. In 1950, when his parents divorced, his mother took the family to begin a new life in Taradale, where they moved into Avondale Road under the shadow of Sugarloaf Hill. Here, Norman attended Green Meadows Primary School with his brother Gavin. Norman described it by saying, "God was in his heaven in 1950s Taradale." I'm quoting from a story written by Norman called A 50s Childhood in Taradale. The complete story can be found at the National Library of New Zealand, and it's a beautifully observed memoir of small town life in New Zealand, sprinkled with wonderful details that only an inquisitive child could store away for later telling. Let me read a few passages from it for you. This is in no particular order, but I've taken these out of the article because I thought they were particularly interesting. Our home was in Avondale Road, and like most places, we were on a party telephone line. 125D was our calling number, and before phoning anyone, the receiver had to be lifted and the question asked, "Working?" How many people remember that? I barely do. A vegetable truck did the rounds of Avondale Road, and a baker carried a large wicker basket of loaves. Each day, the horse-drawn milk float would be seen rattling its way around Taradale's streets. Although, this is Norman talking, I am quite sure a small truck delivered our bottles with their foil caps, holly patterned in December and sprigged with chickens at Easter. My mother walked into town to do her shopping once a week, a red basket on her arm. Groceries came from Yo's busy corner. Mr. Yo never failed to impress me with his skill of reaching up to snatch a length of brown string dangling from a roll beneath the ceiling, which he'd swiftly tie around a bundle of purchases wrapped in brown paper and then snap the string with his bare hands. The school principal, a firm and kindly fellow named Mr. Wimsett, would sometimes phone our mother on wet mornings and often offer to take the 3 of us to school in his small car, provided that we were togged up, always in raincoats and sou'westers for the short walk to the clock tower where he'd stop to pick us up. He knew our mother was a divorcee, a rare species in those days, and I assume he felt sorry for her with the 3 of us to look after. Wild fennel grew in profusion along Guppy Road. Barbara sternly warned me that inhaling the scent would guarantee that I'd wet the bed. Appalled at the possibility, I would gulp down huge lungfuls of air before approaching the said fennel patch, and then I would sprint past, galloping with my bag thumping on my back and my chest aching until I'd safely passed the danger zone. And I love this little recollection. My sister and I joined the choir of All Saints Anglican Church in Taradale, which meant attending practice once a week. Barbara pedalled the bike and I rode on the carrier. Coming home, we followed a spookily ill-lit road lined with poplars. The whirring of the dynamo that powered the bicycle lamp and the faint glow that it cast as we wobbled home provided theatrical effects for Barbara's weekly recital of Alfred Noyes, the Highwayman, one of her favourites. As she pedalled and spoke, I swayed behind her, providing the doleful moaning sound of the moorland wind. Frightening herself silly was one of childhood's chief joys. There came a morning in 1956 when my mother knocked us sideways with the thrilling news that she was going to get married again. We were off to live in a big country house in Gisborne. Our Avondale Road place was sold. We packed up our books and games, and we marvelled at the prospects for the future. Norman's mum married Don Barron, and the family moved to Coolally, the aforementioned big house in the country. Norman's sister Coralie was born a couple of years later. Happy times ensued. During Norman's intermediate years, he was injured. His resulting long convalescence meant that he missed a lengthy period of school, which set him back in maths and critical subjects. Entering Boys High, he was kept in lower streamed classes than he deserved to be in. He was made to feel inadequate. And this feeling of being undervalued would contribute, I think, to his renowned sensitivity to any pupil of his in the same situation. This would become a significant marker in Norman's life. Recently, I wrote of my own experience in a letter of nomination for Norman. And I wrote, I wasn't much good at high school. I was terrible at maths, hopeless at chemistry and biology. However, I felt my saving grace was that I could draw and I could paint quite well. Sadly, drawing and painting were seen as more of a hobby at school rather than a bona fide pillar of education. So it was drummed into me at an early age that my future was doomed. On one of my regular visits to the principal's office, and I can still see his face, asshole. On one of my regular visits to the principal's office to discuss my tardy exam results, the deputy principal told me that while I may enjoy art, and I was quite good at drawing horses, there was no career forthcoming from drawing, and I'd never make any money from it. Well, he was wrong. Returning to Mr. Mclean's art room, he asked what was troubling me. As I began to explain, he laughed and he said, I suggest you don't give that another thought. There's a whole world of opportunity waiting for you, Philip. And he was right. There are many more stories like mine, and I know, Clayton, you have one very similar. Norman gained bursary art in his senior year at Boys High. He studied at Ardmore Teachers Training College, where he developed his love of theatre and drama. And after graduating with a Bachelor of Arts from Otago Polytech, he began full-time teaching, first at Henderson and then at Makaraka. Back in Gisborne, he was to meet a teacher who had an enduring influence on his teaching style. That teacher's name was Forbes Robinson. Does anybody here remember that man? His name was Forbes Robinson. Forbes was renowned for his revolutionary ideas about teaching children to read. He'd come from Central School in Nelson to teach at Wainui Beach School in Gisborne. The Nelson Photo News said this of Forbes, and I've found, I have to say, looking up things about Norman, if you ever want a wonderful historical document, just look at what was the old Photo News. It's still online. And they said, the Nelson Photo News said this of Forbes. The headline said, Nelson's third disaster. First, we lost the railway, then the cotton mill, now we've lost Forbes Robinson. You don't feel that's a disaster? Then you ask the children who have been taught by him and the thousands of children he has packed inside his big car with the huge inflatable tube on the roof rack. You tell them there'll be no more trips to the beach and ice creams, and if the looks on their faces don't spell disaster, then we'll recant. Forbes, a Cambridge MA, could have taught secondary school, but he preferred the primary school children. He has left Central School, where he taught for 18 years, to take over as headmaster of Wainui Beach School. Many adults will miss you, Forbes, but the children will find it doubly hard, especially on those hot summer beachy days. Lucky Gisborne children. Norman taught the children of Gisborne for over 45 years. He was always in demand when each year the local school boards would vie for his services at their school. Consequently, he taught here at Boys High, at Lytton and Edmund Campion College, back and forth throughout his whole career. I had the good fortune to meet Norman when I found myself in his class in 1974. I was 16. I remember my first day, how different it felt in his classroom. No longer was I to endure a disciplinarian teacher on send, but here was an interesting, exciting, gentle male teacher who unusually seemed to be on my level. Excuse me, I find this quite emotional, strangely enough. His classes were amazing and entertaining. He encouraged us to think and to read, to be inquisitive, and always to teach. He always taught us that anything, absolutely anything, was possible. Most noticeably, though, I could tell that he cared. He truly, madly, deeply cared. The next 3 years at Lytton with Norman being at the centre of my education were sublime. I found a quote by Mahatma Gandhi, which must surely have been referenced for Norman when he said, "By education, I mean an all-round drawing out of the best in the child and man, body, mind, and spirit." We talked of history, the classics, the Greeks, the Romans, ancient civilizations, politics, theatre, books, films, religion, comedy, spirituality, the universe, other dimensions, UFOs, the supernatural, the paranormal. Always he talked of possibilities. We read books by Carlos Castaneda, Eric von Däniken, and Lyle Watson. While some of the propositions in these books were considered even then a little fruity, they opened our minds to concepts bigger than everyday life. Norman remained fascinated with the spiritual and all things paranormal his whole life. He was open to the universe and what secrets yet undiscovered it held. The whole thing excited him. Just recently, he'd written to me and Ian McKelvey. He said, "If you haven't already seen the new documentary Phenomenon on Netflix, do not miss it!" We are on the cusp of worldwide acceptance that we are not alone in the universe. Yeehaw! His story wouldn't be complete without touching on his wicked sense of humour. I understand that Norman wanted me to do this today because he said, "Philip will make it funny." And most of what Norman and I found funny, I couldn't talk about in here. So I searched for a story and kept coming back to this one, which wasn't made up, it was entirely true. This wouldn't be complete without touching on his wicked sense of humour and his talent for telling a joke with the accent and immaculate timing. He loved everything from the TV shows like The Royal Family, Keeping Up Appearances and Faulty Towers, to inappropriate and very naughty bottom humour, my personal favourite. He loved reading the latest copy of Viz magazine that my sister Jill would excitedly hand over each month at their regular G&T sessions. Viz, for those that don't know, is a bawdy Northern English comic featuring such characters as Two Fat Slags and Buster Gonad and his unfeasibly large testicles. He possessed a quick wit, which is best demonstrated with this sacred memory of mine. It was a hot summer's afternoon at Lytton. All the classroom windows were open to allow what little breeze there was to ventilate the room. A couple of troublemaker boys, there's always a couple in every class, right? Were down the back sniggering and carrying on and generally disrupting Norman's class. It was clear that Norman was becoming irritated with them. The next thing, something was lobbed through the window and hit the ceiling with a slap. One of the boys shot his hands up with glee and announced, "Sir, Mr. Mclean, sir, there is a shit on your ceiling." And without hesitation, Norman replied, "Ah, yes, I see there is. I can also see that even as we look, the work of gravity is afoot. Surely, slowly but surely, it is unsticking itself from my ceiling, and soon it will drop and land on your desk." There was definitely something in the water in those years of 1974 to 76. And I suddenly had a thought that Harry Barker was the mayor, and didn't he always go on about the water? Wasn't that the thing? Maybe it was Harry Barker's water. There was an intake of exceptional young men at Lytton back then. Men like Ian Finlay, Russell Stewart, Darryl File, Maurice Kirby, Richard Rogers. These were young men with bright futures, and they complemented Norman's style to a T. It was around that time that Norman met Isla. This is tough. They fell in love and bought a home together in a large, sunny section in Riverside Road. They were both passionate gardeners and soon converted the wild, sloping section of weeds into a hillside of flowers and vegetables. They were happy together. Isla in her garden, blonde, tanned, and very naked, and Norman painting and printmaking in his studio. They both loved the sun. It seemed like an idyllic life. They married in a small ceremony in March 1978, but sadly it wasn't to last. A year later, on his birthday, she left. While he only spoke of her to me occasionally after that, it was clear that for a brief moment, a joyous flame had flickered ever so brightly for him. He never married again. As the days passed, his enthusiasm for life won through, and his energy for the arts grew exponentially. He painted, he drew, he wrote, he acted, he directed, he produced. He made an astonishing body of work, all while teaching and volunteering in the various artistic groups in the city. As he got back on his feet, he met someone who was to become very special to him, Maureen Anderson, and I've seen Maureen here today. Maureen and Norman became very close friends, and as time has shown, they have become life companions. They were to enjoy 34 years of friendship together. The other day I called Maureen and I asked her what she would like to say about Norman, and she said this: "He was such a sublime soul, so open to the greater universe. The radiance of his wise spirit will forever resonate in my soul. I stumble while gratitude for Norman's presence and vast achievements circle." I think that's a really beautiful thing to say. Too much like my father. By now, Norman was well known in the art circles in the area. He had joined the Gisborne Art Society in 1968. Regularly exhibiting and organising shows, he performed the full range of administrative duties, from sweeping the floor to being the chairperson. He also represented the Society on countless community advisory boards, the Gisborne Museum of Art and History Trust, the Friends of the Museum, Pride in Gisborne Trust, and the Gisborne District Council's Creative Community Committee. All were benefactors of Norman's energy. He was instrumental in establishing the Gisborne Printmakers Group in 1976 and oversaw the move to a purpose-built printmaking studio at Leisner House. He was awarded life membership in 2010. Some 50 years ago, Norman joined Unity Theatre. Beginning as an actor, he played an active role in the theatre. He painted sets, he gathered props, he sold the tickets, he did the lighting, produced and directed, also serving as the vice president and president. In his time, he directed 24 different plays. Typically, he shared his love of drama with his school pupils, encouraging them to give it a try. This is how many got their start into drama. His most recent play, and his last, the acclaimed Michael James Mania, required a solo role which was convincingly and powerfully played by Lawrence Mulligan. Lawrence had been one of those pupils who Norman had encouraged earlier in his life. Norman was awarded life membership of Unity. He was also the recipient of the Manuka Award for his contribution to printmaking in Gisborne, and in 2016, in recognition of his extensive voluntary contribution to the arts in Gisborne, he was awarded the Gisborne District Council Civic Award. Most recently, a group of his friends and admirers got together to nominate Norman for a New Year New Zealand Royal Honour. Among the long list of requirements for this is the submission of at least 2 letters that endorse the nominee's contribution from people who are familiar with their service and achievements. Norman had 12. Sadly, he wasn't to live long enough to receive this high honour, and equally sadly, they are not awarded posthumously. Bugger. Nearly there. The last 6 or so years of his life really challenged his health, requiring many operations and the ensuing convalescent time. Despite this, he always was unfathomably positive. He never seemed to get down about anything. I remember visiting him in Auckland Hospital after his kidney operation, and he was full of praise for the New Zealand health system, saying how amazing it was that he had been flown up in an ambulance aeroplane just for him. A couple of years later, I visited him in Hamilton Hospital after he'd had a grueling 7-hour operation. It seemed like they'd opened him up, taken out all sorts of organs, and then they hadn't put them all back. It had been one hell of a thing for him to endure. Sitting with him, he was calmly candid about dying. He was very weak and slipping in and out of consciousness. He said to me, "I'm not afraid of dying. Actually, I'm quite looking forward to it. I'm finally going to see the next dimension. Can you imagine the sheer ecstasy of it, Philip? The ultimate trip. Whee!" He said, "I'm also looking forward to seeing old friends again, and I'm also really looking forward to haunting you. So can you keep your senses open when I'm gone, for goodness sake?" I said, "Well, Norman, you aren't going anywhere yet. I'll see you in Gisborne." And he looked at me with half-closed eyes as he was drifting off again. With a barely perceptible smile, he said, "Yes, you will, one way or the other." On the drive home to Wellington, I stopped in Taupo, and I bought him a gift to send to his home for when he got back. It was a board game called Operation, that one where each player has a turn of removing the organs while risking an electric shock. I knew that he'd get a laugh from it. Well, here we are. I hope you feel that I've captured some of the story of this beautiful soul, this artistic, selfless, talented teacher. I've tried to touch on the quintessential parts of his life that paint a picture, how fitting, of what an extraordinary guy he really was. I know that I've missed a lot about his travel, but it's just too much. Regardless of how we all knew Norman, we have all been taught by him. In my task of summing up this beautiful man, I'd say beyond his enormous body of work, all of his paintings, all of his prints, all of his plays and all of his artwork, all of his books and all of his writing, in one stupendous lifetime, I'd say his greatest body of work is us. Thank you.
Philip, Norman would have been very proud to have heard you today. The humour that you managed to instill and the complete capture of the things that matter. So thank you very much indeed. Coralie, we come now to you as the first of the family members to speak, and I just want to take this opportunity to acknowledge you and all the work you've done to set this up for today, especially getting me here. So Coralie.
My strongest memories of the room at the end of the upstairs corridor at our home are ones of smells, of oil paint and terps and Old Spice aftershave. It was, of course, Norman's room, Nornu, as I called him as a little girl. My three much older siblings were wonderful to their little sister. And as you can imagine, Norman was a very cool big brother. What kid wouldn't want to have someone who could draw anything they asked for and was always funny? Norman and Gavin used to bike to the end of the road to catch the school bus. And when I started school, one of them would take both his school bags on the carrier and the other would take me. Norman always claimed that I reeked on the school bus of Lane's emulsion, which was a rather foul, thick tonic liquid that Mum spooned into me before school. I think it was mainly cod liver oil, so I think he was probably right. He called me Dragon. And I had a book about dragons, and I think he was under the impression that I was obsessed with them, which I wasn't really. But the nickname stuck well into adulthood. In fact, until quite recently. When Norman left school for Ardmore, he took the scarf that Mum had knitted for him, if I remember rightly, in red and white. And then after Ardmore, he was teaching at Henderson, and he boarded with a couple who had that amazing newfangled contraption, a television set. And Norman would come home and regale me with wondrous stories of such things as Lost in Space and Mr. Ed the Talking Horse. And he'd sing me the whole Mr. Ed song. He came home then to teach at Makaraka School for a year or two and lived at home. And what joy to escape the school bus and to rattle along in his old Ford Prefect, which he called Ptolemy, being entertained all the way with funny stories and jokes, and being teased mercilessly about my witch's breeches, which we girls wore under our skirts in the winter in those days. They came to just above our knees and they were lavishly trimmed with lace, which he thought were hilarious. He wasn't the greatest driver. I can remember sometimes he drove impatiently through herds of cattle on the road, and luckily Ptolemy didn't ever get kicked by one. He then moved quite quickly to secondary teaching here at Boys High, and in the art room of his mentor and now friend, Graham Mudge. I was at Girls High, and in about the fourth form, which is now year 10, our English teacher asked us to write a letter to the editor as an exercise, and it was to be a protest at the French testing of nuclear weapons in the Pacific. Well, Norman seized on this with glee and wrote it for me. The teacher was really impressed and asked me if I wrote it myself, and I said, well, my brother helped me a bit. You didn't know I was a devious little wretch, did you? How old's your brother, she said. 26. And I think one wag in the class asked the teacher if she was interested. The letter was duly published in the Gisborne Herald, proudly signed by me. It was 1972, which was an election year, and I think the final line read something along the lines of, we can only hope for fallout of a different kind in November, which a gauche 14-year-old me could never have thought of. Norman inspired my love of art, of literature, and most of all of history. He's been a towering presence in my 65 years, and for however many years I have left, he leaves an enormous hole.
Thank you, Kylie, for precious memories and sentiments. We're still with family, and Gavin, it's my pleasure to ask you to now speak. There is a special connection between you and our family through Gisborne Boys High School. And would you like to give us your recollections now, please?
First of all, thank you both, Coralie, for better memory than I have. Everybody here for coming and making us so sad. And Philip for a fabulous, fabulous story. In August 2021, Norman wrote the following: I live in the past, and to some extent have always done so. Little wonder then that I taught art and history for many years, especially classical studies. Ancient Greece and Rome are where I wander in my head, and their imagery influences painting and printmaking as well as my writing. When it comes to contemporary culture, I'm largely clueless. I dislike fashionable anything. Style is more useful from an artistic point of view, and yet visual art is bedeviled by fashionable trends. Perhaps that's why my house prompts visitors' comments on its many images, memorabilia, extensive library, and paintings. He doesn't mention the Donald Trump toilet paper. They reflect my own style, the way I think and live. There's nothing fashionable in my house, and there never will be. I'm attracted to a quote from the great Roman statesman Cicero. If a man has a library and a garden, that is all he needs. Being surrounded by growing things that need tending affords a great deal of satisfaction. I'm completely contented at home, never bored, never lonely. Last year's lockdown was bliss in most respects, as there was peace and quiet and time for long walks, listening to music while painting, reading, and pottering in garden spaces. I've greatly enjoyed overseas travel, but decided if such jaunting is now over because of COVID, I don't much mind. The privilege of living in this country should not be taken for granted. How many times has he said that? Retirement has brought the realization that life has never been better. I have no apprehensions about the future and find myself completely at ease with life in general. Last year, near his very lowest point in Waikato Hospital, he dictated this: "Of all life's great joys, the greatest is love given and received. Love is a cliche and also the only reality, which I am experiencing already with great delight. As many who know me will realize, it is fundamental to my whole outlook. Key figures are my much-loved mother, Sister Barbara, dearly loved Jonathan, and hundreds of others." And these are all people who have passed. "I'm with you right now, all of you. If you doubt my conviction about the perpetuity of life, please watch for any sign I may be able to convey. It's not always easily available, even to those who are watching. Talk to Gavin about the growing body of scientific evidence for the reality of the unseen, the higher life that only wants to be acknowledged, joy and peace in all things. What the caterpillar calls the end of the world, the master calls the butterfly. I'm no master, but no bug on a leaf either. Have a drink with me, for me. I look forward to being there when your time comes, so that I can say, see, I told you. Love extensively. All else is inadequate." So, Norman wanted his celebration to be bright and happy, but my sense of humour has been failing me. However, humour and sorrow are good bedfellows. Norman and I were once at a funeral that was eerily devoid of sadness, and that eventually became for us a very sad memory. So along with Mark Antony, I don't mind saying, if you have tears, prepare to shed them. Prepare to shed them now. Separate though our lives were, the affinity was lasting. Perhaps you need not talk to me about the reality of the unseen, unless you have 3 hours to spare. In the 60s, Norman discovered spiritualism, mainly the renowned Forbes E. Robinson, whom he called Forbes Elizabeth. Convert to spiritualism, sharing books with me and proving himself something of a medium. I was a ready convert, and though I later reverted to a more rationalist interpretation, he's always shared, as with many of you, the myriad of strange stories, first-hand and second-hand, that cannot all be dismissed as mere anecdote. We do have a long way to go to reconcile these with our scientific worldview. At family gatherings, he always had us in fits, whether with his wit, memory, or huge repertoire of jokes, a very few of which would be acceptable in polite company. His childhood stories tended to harp on the most embarrassing moments or statements of his little brother. To get my own back, what about that hot day in Taradale with 2 little boys sitting on the back porch and Norman convinced he could get his underpants off without removing his shorts? He struggled manfully, in defiance of what any student of topology could tell him, and had a leg of white flannel stretched painfully down one thigh when the neighbour popped round the corner. Norman popped promptly back into shape. I forget what he said, but he was always good at improv. The dramatic urge started so early. I remember playing with friends when Norman went ahead of 3 of us to pick up a spear or an arrow or something. And Cedric Witters turned to us and said, "Watch the dramatics." Held us back. Sure enough, his walk broke into a demented, sustained polonaise through the shrubbery. Just a few years ago, I stripped paint off one of our Rimu doors to find scratched into the older paint and the wood, "Help. SOS. NM." The door had once been taken down and leaned against a wall for several weeks, so of course the 10-year-old dramatist pictured somebody trapped forever behind it. You can still read the etching under new varnish in our bathroom. I took the passport photo for Norman's very first overseas trip, with a sheet on the clothesline as background. Over and over again, every time I put eye to viewfinder, I saw another hideous, distorted face gawping at me. In years to come, he begged and begged me to burn the resulting series of pictures. Sadly, I did. Norman's quick eye for detail meant he always won the prize at birthday parties for remembering the contents of a tray after seeing them for 5 or 10 seconds. For over 70 years, his childhood recollections were adorned with what people wore, and his knowledge of period costuming for painting and for theatre was extraordinary. The theatre was one area of collaboration between us. Norman designed and painted sets for many of my productions and gave practical advice when I asked for it. Of all his art, I think I always most admired the quick sketches and the Monet-like scene painting, a bit surreal up close, but magically perfect in the distance. I still remember a rag hanging on a wall in Fiddler on the Roof, which most people probably thought was real. He never fussed about health failings. Told in June he had just months to live, he kept it close to his chest and enjoyed a last jaunt in Europe before telling his family. Even in the brief, lucid moments of the week before last, he remained jocular, ironical, and mimicking. Among so many who gave love and practical support, I must mention a few and beg your forgiveness for many omissions. Mary Hayes, a lifelong family friend, visited him almost daily last year in Waikato Hospital and travelled to Gisborne the week before last, as did Richard Egan, all the way from Dunedin, to be with him day and night while they could. Coralie and Robert were outstanding. In the years following the non-trivial donation of a kidney, they provided untold care. That was Coralie, not Robert. They provided untold care, organising, visiting, and nursing him in their home. Maria Jefferson has bestowed loving generosity over the years, but especially towards the last, when I beheld her in action, with meals, housekeeping, nursing, advice, and organising. If you can picture a sort of perpetual motion machine with a heart, you've got Maria sussed. Her sister, Dr. Sarah Callaghan, cared far beyond the call of duty, as did her team from Hospice Tairāwhiti. They were a boon not just to Norman, but to us all. The week before last, while struggling to speak or stay awake, Norman started dictating to me and didn't finish, but write this down. It was unnecessary, even wrong, but I will honour him by sharing the essence. My love for Gavin was never as well expressed as it should have been. We had a life of mutual dependence and wanted no other way. I can only tell you I was certainly not aware of any such transgression on his part. Love was indeed the reality.
Thanks very much, Gavin, and my goodness, you did that last bit incredibly well. Thank you. You'll see up here the very, very big screen, and what we're now going to have are some pictures relating to Norman. So now's the time to look back and to look at something slightly better than you're looking at the moment.
Norman must have really liked that photo and wanted us all to see it for ages.
Some very special memories there. I think the one with Norman with the apple in his mouth is probably takes the first prize. But what marvellous memories. We move on to have some memories from past students, and Clayton is going to give us that honour. I just thought as a matter of interest, if you were taught by Norman, would you be able to raise a hand, please? And that pretty much sets the scene for why we're here in this hall today. So thank you very much. Clayton.
Kia ora tātou. Nā mihi ki a koe Norman. Haere, haere, haere atu rā. For those who don't know me, my name is Clayton Gibson. It's a real privilege and an honour to be standing here and representing literally the thousands of students who were taught by Norman Mclean over the years. I didn't know about Makaraka School, but at Gisborne Boys High School, Lytton and Campion College. And I was also a colleague of Norman's at Campion College and also a fellow practicing artist. It was great to get a reference to Forbes Robinson because as a 4-year-old, I would run away from home about a quarter of a mile away from Wainui Beach School. Most of my siblings were at Wainui Beach School, and my mum would not know, but I would disappear down to the primary school, and I'd go into Forbes's room, and he would pick me up in his arms, and he'd throw me up in the air, and then eventually, and he'd keep me in his classroom until 3 o'clock when I'd go home with all my siblings, and sometimes my mum would realise that I was missing at that point. So it was great to hear that reference to Forbes Robinson. You know, I've heard several stories over the last couple of days and of ex-students of Norman's, and basically they were telling me my story. My version of being a student in Norman's classrooms is just a slightly different version of everybody else's. When I heard the news of Norman's passing last week, you know, the text messages start, you know, going around, and I got one text message that said that a mighty Cody has fallen, and though I understood the reference to this, and I thought to myself the metaphor was not quite correct, because we knew how much Norman loved Aotearoa. He loved the nature here, loved the beach, he loved the ngahere. But those of us who probably inspired by Norman have been and visited the Greek islands or Greece, you know, some far distant field of Naxos or somewhere like that, and you see those old gnarled, olive trees, and those olive trees, when you sat next to them, it was just like stepping into one of Norman's paintings or etchings. And those old olive trees, you know, you felt like they had been there for hundreds of years and soaked up the knowledge and the history of those places. And when I got this text, I thought, you know, it's like one of these olive trees has just said, it's time to pass, go into the next realm. And when I thought of all the students that I'm representing today, I thought, you know, we're just like the olives that have fallen to the ground, the pips, and we are the little seedlings that are growing out of the ground for the next generation, you know. The question is, you know, Philip said it so beautifully what it was like to be a student in Norman's classroom. Every time so even in my personal family, I've got a lot of siblings. Norman directed plays with my oldest two brothers, Tony and Kerry. That was in Gisborne Boys High School in the 1960s. 1970s, he was my art teacher. In the 1980s, he was my younger brother's art teacher, and my younger brother's been a lifelong friend of Norman's. he would be here today, but he busted up his knees the other day, and he's in a wheelchair. But he's probably listening out today, so he loved Norman just as much as his other students. But what was it like to be a student in Norman's? At Lytton High School, I would go to take the handle of the door going into the classroom. And it was always a threshold moment. Because once you turned that handle and you moved into his classroom, into his realm, you knew that you were going to be challenged, but you knew that your soul was going to be absolutely met. He enriched our souls, and you knew that you were going to get a real education. You know, Philip mentioned at the beginning that were coming up. That was like listening to Norman. Somebody just mentioned to me sometimes you'd have a class and he would just read to you. You know, he brought the wisdom of the ancient Greek philosophers. He brought the concepts of all the great artists. He brought spiritual realities or questions to us, and any subject was open for discussion. And his great sense of humour, you know, he brought these puns to the classroom. You know, he was a funny guy. All of us have these stories, and I hope afterwards that we can share amongst yourselves, you know, your particular stories. But I would just like to share one today. I've shared it with some of you before. Like Philip, I entered high school. I am dyslexic. I was dyslexic then, so I entered high school as a non-reader. And Peter Day's here today, so I've warned him that I'm going to tell them this story. So Peter Day, we're 14-year-olds sitting in his classroom, and Peter's given me a bit of a hard time. And Peter, even at the age of 14, was well read. Now he's he's received lots of awards as a documentary producer. But Peter's given me a hard time. He's saying, "Clayton, you've never read a book." And I said, "Well, no, Peter, I'm not very good at reading." And Peter just couldn't believe this. And Norman goes past and he hears this and he says, he always used to put a hand on my shoulder and support. And he said, "Clayton, you've never read a book." And I said, "No, sir," because we called our teachers sir, obviously, in those days. No, sir, I've never read a book." So he went home that night. And the next day, he just puts his book on my desk. And he said, I still remember almost the exact quote. He said, "Clayton, if that doesn't get you reading, nothing will." So I looked down, and I'd never read a novel. This book was about this thin, and I thought, yeah, that's probably manageable. You know, it looks about 120 pages. And it was a story called The Soldier's Tale by a New Zealand author. And it was about an escaped prisoner of war. He had been hosted by a beautiful French woman in the French resistance. And I won't go into the details, but you can imagine the adventures that he had. And I couldn't remember the book ending, but my friend, when I was telling him a story the other day, he recounted the tragic ending. And being a melancholic temperament, I realized that tragic ending to that book also reached my soul. And as many have expressed, you know, somehow Norman was able to read us as students, as individuals, and there were thousands of moments like that, not just with me, but with all those people who've put their hands up and all the other thousands of people who have been taught by him. At the age of 16, he invited me to join the Gisborne Printmakers group. And I knew that this wasn't going to be my genre in the future. But the group of people that were in that room, I can see David was sitting in front of me, people like Phyllis Underdown, Graham Mudge, Jean Johnson, Penny Ormerod. I just loved being around the conversation. There were others too, sorry. I enjoyed just hearing the conversation, hearing the laughter, their senses of humour, it brought me into this world of the world of artists, and it made me start to think that I was an artist. Through that meeting, we went to anthroposophical study groups, and it brought me to this thinking about spiritual philosophy. And I've spent my life as a Rudolf Steiner teacher. I'm sitting next to my wife, who's the General Secretary of the Anthroposophical Society in New Zealand. And so those small encounters, those small meetings were so pivotal in all of our lives. Just like this, what's just happened on the floor here. I haven't had a motor accident for about 30 years, but when I heard Norman's passing, I was in a waka ama race, and I don't usually putter out before the end, but I puttered out that day and thought, Norman, what are you doing? And then next minute, I jumped in my car, backed it into a concrete bollard, and I just thought, you're playing with me, Norman. So, you know, Norman wasn't our parent. He wasn't my father. All of us students, we had our own parents. But in most of our lives, he was a pivotal influence in our lives. And as I said, he really met our souls. And even though he wasn't our parent, I think in some way, all those people in the room today and all the thousands like me, we were his children. And then I saw these quotes up there, Norman, and as I said, one thing I was going to say before I finish off is that as a 16-year-old or 17-year-old, and you've all had this experience as adults as well, I used to walk into his house and first in Harris Street, and then Riverside Road, and then Central Street, and sometimes he wasn't even home, you know, and I wasn't a reader, so I didn't read the books off his shelf. But all of you know what it's like to soak up the aesthetics in his house, to soak up the history, to just get that mauri, that wairua that was in his house. I think there was a quote up there before that was quoted before, if you have a garden and a library, you know, you've got life. And then I experienced exactly the same thing when I took my 10-year-old son, who's sitting over there, I took my 10-year-old son into his house. And being at a Steiner school, Norman said, "Oh, what are you studying at school, Hamiora or Samuel?" And my son said, "Oh, ancient Greece." And Norman went out of the room, and he comes back in, and he puts on his lap a Greek helmet. About 15 minutes later, Norman's chatting with my son and says, "What else are you studying at school?" My son says, "Ancient India." Norman goes to the shelf and he takes out this little container from Sai Baba filled with ashes from Sai Baba's ashram and gives my son a pinch of ashes from Sai Baba. And then I saw this quote up there, and I haven't got my glasses on. At the sunset of life, we will be judged by our love. He gave us a huge amount of love, and we gave him love back. And it's, as I said, it's a great privilege, Norman, to have you as part of my life. And I know that all of you ex-students would like to be standing up here and saying the same thing. So, nā mihi anō kia koutou, Norman, haere atu rā.
It was decided, a really good idea, I think, that Norman ought to be recognised. And so I and others were asked to join in recognising Norman in the country of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I just want to especially here acknowledge Jill White, who was very much in touch with me. So, Nisbet, you're going to now give us all a bit of an idea of what happened and why and some insights.
Kia ora koutou, greetings. My name is Nisbet Smith, and it all started with Betty the cat. She was well represented up on the screen. Norman had to go into hospital 18 months or so ago for a short time, a few days, maybe a week, maybe a little bit longer, and he needed someone to look after Betty. So having known Norman for many years as a friend and as a colleague when I worked at Tairāwhiti Polytech, I agreed to take care of Betty. Well, of course, as we know, that few days or a week turned into several months, and we were all very, very worried about Norman during that time. But while I was doing the house sit or the cat sit, I got numerous calls from friends, colleagues, asking about how Norman was, and he'd left his cell phone number, so I passed that on. And inevitably I'd get a call back saying, does Norman actually know how to work a cell phone? And we'd get into a discussion about how they were connected with Norman. And I was very privileged to get a cross-section through Norman's life. I call it a profile of connectedness. And it was all those people who cared very, very deeply for their dear friend. And it got me thinking, gosh, you know, this man must be honoured in the world, and started looking around the walls for the MBE or OBE or whatever it was that it was called in those days. And sure, there was a civic award from the Gisborne District Council, and I decided to talk with Coralie and Robert about you know, whether there had in fact been an honour, a royal honour for Norman, and that hadn't been the case. So I waited for a little while thinking someone will pick this up. And one day coincided with Jean Johnson, and she was, yes, absolutely, very, very deserving of an honour, and let's get the process going. So and Jean, I give my heartfelt thanks for all the work that you did on this project. You took leadership for the process and drove the process as our researcher. She also came up with two absolutely brilliant people to bring on board. Could I have Jill White and Dave Andrew and Jean please stand up for a moment, because they were absolutely pivotal in pulling the process together. Thank you so much, all of you, an absolutely brilliant team. So we began a series of Friday meetings, which I call Cake and Subterfuge. The cake came from Dave, astounding cook. Have a meeting at his place whenever you need it. It is absolutely phenomenal catering. The subterfuge was having a story just in case Norman turned up. So our story was that we were organising a bagpipe festival, and that was going to cover any chance of Norman just walking in the door. As Peter Boucher pointed out, we needed 2 letters to support the application. We got 12. We probably could have got 120 if we'd asked wider. And we put all of those 12 letters in to the nomination. So I'm going to just read very briefly 1 or 2 quotes that came in from the astounding support for Norman in royal honours. Norman is a very generous, talented and erudite man who does a great deal to enliven and inform our community. Norman is a person of enormous integrity and principle. In short, he is a role model, and I'm fortunate to be one of those who have benefited. Norman Mclean is a deep font of knowledge, a doyen of art and culture, a wealth of wisdom, and a positive influence on everyone he crosses paths with. His encouragement and generosity through teaching, his immersion in the arts, and his warmth of humanity have made an immeasurable difference to so many people. The awards group ourselves were honoured to inform Norman of the awards process in hospital just 3 days before he died. And to say that he was deeply moved is an understatement. Unfortunately, as Peter pointed out, a posthumous award is not possible. We all shed a tear as we read from the letters and left Norman in no doubt as to the huge positive effect he'd had on friends and colleagues' lives. So I'd like you to join with us, the NAG team, as we were called, the Norman Award Grant team, Norman Awards Group. Please join with us in honouring a great human being, Norman Hayden Mclean. And I'd like to start the Waiata Te Aroha, the words being love, faith, and peace for all, words that truly embody the spirit of Norman Mclean. Te aroha, te whakapono, te rangi mari e, tato tato e, te aroha, te whakapono, te rangi mari e, tato tato e.
Thank you very much, Nisbet. Just like to let you know what now happens, and then I'm going to, in a minute or two, ask you if you'd be kind enough to stand. What I'm going to do is to say goodbye to Norman on your behalf. At the end of that, the pallbearers will come forward and take Norman out, and there'll be the chance for you to pay your respects to Norman personally. Then the lilt of the pipes will arise as Norman's brother-in-law, Robert, pipes the hearse away. When I read this to you, there may be some tears, and that's the way it should be. And I think it's an entirely right way to end today's service. So would you be kind enough now to stand, please? Norman, your life we honour, your departure we accept, your memory we cherish. And although there is grief today as we say goodbye, there is gratitude for your life. We are truly grateful for the privilege of having shared life with you. But rest now at the end of your days. Rest in the hearts and minds of all those who love you. And so, with love, we shall leave you in peace. And with respect, we bid you a fond farewell as we now move to concluding this service, saying goodbye, and we commit your body to be created. Kua henga te rākau o te wā nui a tāne. Hoi au noi rā e te rangatira e Norman. Haere atu ki ngā ringa o tō tātou taihanga. Moi mai rā, moi mai rā. And if the pallbearers would now come forward.
Comfort ye my people, saith your God. Speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem, and cry unto her that her warfare is accomplished, that her iniquity is pardoned. For she hath received of the Lord's hand double for all her sins. The voice of him that crieth in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places plain. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it. The voice said, Cry.